Welcome to High Impact Growth, a podcast from Dimagi for people committed to creating a world where everyone has access to the services they need to thrive. We bring you candid conversations with leaders across global health and development about raising the bar on what's possible with technology and human creativity. I'm Amy Vaccaro, Senior Director of Marketing at Dimagi and your co-host, along with Jonathan Jackson, Dimagi's CEO and co-founder. Today, we're diving into a pretty big question that's on a lot of our minds. In a world where global health budgets are tight and things are changing fast, how do organizations not just keep their heads above water, but actually redefine what success looks like? And to help us unpack all of that, we're thrilled to have Nithya Ramanathan with us. She's the co-founder and CEO of Nexleaf Analytics and a real trailblazer in global health technology. For 15 years, Nithya has been pioneering these incredible data-driven, scalable health solutions. You might have heard of her work from the sensor technology that's now keeping an eye on the vaccine supply for 1 out of every 7 babies born worldwide. It's pretty amazing stuff. So in this episode, which is definitely a rich one, we get into Nexleaf's fascinating journey, like their switch from a for-profit to a nonprofit, and a really gutsy move they made to purposefully shake up their own device business, all for the sake of bigger impact. We'll also be talking through the tricky world of business models in global health, what it really means to own the outcome, and Nithya's take on the idea that the system has been burned down. Honestly, this is a fantastic listen if you're a social entrepreneur, working in global health, or just anyone trying to figure out sustainable business models when you're driven by impact. It's a dense conversation, perfect for those of you deep in this space. If you're wrestling with how to scale, when to pivot, and how to really show your value when resources are scarce, you're going to walk away with some serious food for thought on the tough calls and creative thinking needed to not just make it through, but to actually help build what comes next. Enjoy. Awesome. Well, welcome to the podcast. We are here today and we're honored to be joined by Nithya Ramanathan, who is CEO and co-founder of Nexleaf Analytics. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm super psyched to be here.
Awesome to have you here, Nithya. We met probably over a decade ago, right? Like the first time we crossed paths at the Gates Foundation, competing for some award, I'm sure, way back in the day.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Though, actually, I don't know that I've mentioned this to you, John. I feel like we were in the room together 20 years ago when I was in grad school and I had gone to one of these Tech for Good conferences. And I am barely sure I was actually in a room with you and Rainey. I could be making that up. But
That's very plausible. 20 years ago, there was only, 50 of us? So I think we were all in a room together at some point.
yeah, and it was 50 of you guys. I was a lowly PhD student trying to get into the room, but you guys all knew each other for sure.
Awesome.
It was very cool.
Awesome. Well, it's a privilege to have you on, Nithya. And gosh, it feels like ages have passed since we first connected to talk about this episode. So much has changed so quickly. But maybe we'll start just with a little bit of your backstory. Clearly, you and John go back many years, friends, fellow social entrepreneur, but would love to just hear a bit about your story.
Yeah. So Nexleaf's been on this mission for about 15 years to actually support health systems that are country-driven, that are data-driven, that are resource efficient and scalable. And so that's actually what that's been the vision from the very beginning. And we've been sort of just building the building blocks towards that with countries. And so actually the very first step we took was really understanding how refrigerators for vaccines were managed as part of this much larger health system challenge. And we were in my garage, because that is where all great companies start, of course. And we were in my garage for about 5 years. I'm not going to lie to you. But we started manufacturing temperature sensors that could go into refrigerators and produce objective, real-time, immediate data. And, at the time, people really thought we were crazy. There was a lot of pushback on why on earth would you put a internet-connected temperature sensor into a last-mile facility? Like, what could that possibly achieve? And because we were new and naive and we didn't have a lot of the baggage that existed, we just kind of kept following users, following the ministry's perspective, and really kind of addressing that. And so we manufactured temperature sensors for vaccine fridges. ended up scaling those because there was so much demand for this type of data. And those sensors now monitor the vaccine supply globally for 1 in 7 babies born each year. And from there have had just tremendous success in kind of continuing to build out more building blocks based on what countries need for health systems delivery.
That's amazing. That stat of the sensors that you've worked on are helping protect the vaccine supply for 1 in 7 babies born. Wow, that's really amazing. And you are structured as a nonprofit, is that right? I'm
Yeah.
curious to understand a little bit of like the workings with ministries of health. And like, John and I often talk on the show about business models and how do you keep things sustainable. But I'm curious to learn a little bit about the model.
Yeah. This is something that John and I have talked about a number of times. So actually, when we first started, we were a for-profit. We were called Lorax Analytics, LLC. We simultaneously got a cease and desist from Dr. Seuss's estate. Um, but separately, actually, we saw pretty quickly that the conversations we were trying to have were really hard to have because people intrinsically sort of distrusted for-profits. And John, I'm super curious because I know Demagi's registered as a for-profit. You probably, because you've been at this probably longer than almost anybody else, like you probably encountered a lot of that. But I'll give you kind of my side of this, which is I was just too frustrated at the kind of what I thought was stupidity. Because to me, it's sort of a tax structure. As a nonprofit, we're allowed to sell things just like universities, at least for now. Universities were allowed to sell things, but we'll see what happens. But anyways, as a nonprofit, we're allowed to sell things at a profit. We're allowed to do profit generating activities, all of that. So we just got really impatient. And so we actually just quickly shifted gears and filed as a 501c3 in order to kind of go back to those very same people. It was still me and Martin, in our sweatshirts from grad school. And suddenly all the conversations really opened up, whether it was with, academics or donors or even at the country level. I think now things are really different. And if we started Nexleaf today, I don't know, we might file as a different structure. But yeah, John, I'm curious, what have you faced or what did you face back then? And I'm curious.
We definitely sense that kind of inherent distrust of for-profits trying to enter the do-gooder space. I think it's very different 2 decades later. That was one of the things where I was like, okay, proprietary software plus for-profit is just a non-starter. There was a company that had existed back then that was proprietary, kind of shifted their business model, and a lot of governments felt burned when they were like, okay, well, give us the system, give us our data. And the company was like, no, we're done. And it's our software and our data. We're out of here. So we always thought it was really important as a for-profit to have not just the credibility. I think people understood we were in this to do good and empower the health systems we were trying to support, but they were like, show us for real. And so that was where a lot of our open source ethos came from. I mean, we're deep believers in open source in general, but it was also kind of out of necessity. The reason we stayed a for-profit, I think, from a software standpoint and a business model standpoint, I was kind of like, look, I think the way software is going to be helpful is only if we get a viable business model. I was never kind of like in the camp of give us a bunch of central funding, we'll give away the software and somehow that'll work. I was like, we need a flywheel. 20 years later, we're still iterating on that flywheel, searching for that flywheel. We've had moments where we feel like it's working. This is not one of them, unfortunately, in this moment in time. But that was always part of, our ethos. And we also weren't going after some of the funders. We were locked out of some of the funders, as a for-profit because they were only willing to put money into nonprofits. Again, that shifted some, but even today, there's some donors, some foundations that we just can't even start talking to.
Yeah. We both know. Yeah. Yeah. Who I know respect you tremendously and are like, yeah, but Demag is a for-profit. I challenge that all the time. I think it's really stupid. I'm not going to lie. I think it's not helpful. Again, it's a tax structure, where that money goes. And, I'm pretty sure, John, you're not a billionaire, as a result of this for-profit. So. Or maybe you are, in which case, yeah.
I only wish. But no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think I've ever since we, met and I learned about the business model, I think having, a hardware business where you're literally selling SKUs and product and you can charge profit, like that's what many for-profit companies do normally, services business. And as I said a lot over the last decade or so, like I've met nonprofits who are way more cutthroat than some of the for-profits I know. So it also like doesn't even speak to your like culture as a company, like I've met some nonprofits who are just like ruthless. And
Yeah.
and so it doesn't even, it's about the business model, it's about the deployment model. And you're right, it's just the tax structure and accounting rules.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it was something that's interesting that you sort of brought up is, you know, I think a lot of people's business models have been totally blown up in this moment. Um, One of the things that I've been thinking about that, I'll just think about out loud with you, which you and I love to do, and, listeners, is around Nextleaf's business model. Because as you mentioned, Nextleaf, yes, we have been in the business of selling devices, but we haven't been in the business to sell devices.
Yeah, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, so selling devices has very much actually been a tactic for us because of so many other things that it unlocks. Like, we are probably operate one of the biggest, IoT networks in certainly in vaccines and probably in across global health. It's allowed us to kind of have credibility and trust and like entry point and like, we get a seat at the table with ministries um, because we kind of bring this value add, but actually it's always been its tactic. And so one of the things that we decided to do that I will say, I'll say two things. One, I think we had the permission and mandate to do as a nonprofit, but actually, truth be told, my board really disagreed and like it caused a lot of tension. But one of the things that we did do was sort of cannibalize our device business by working with, when we saw that like actually having standalone devices was providing a ton of value, but actually operationally was not the right move for countries. We actually did work with Gavi and WHO and UNICEF to actually advocate for and help build a set of standards and procurement methods to actually integrate the device into the fridge. And we did that for a number of reasons, but one, we used that as a moment to also advocate for interoperability standards, which we're sorely missing, as you know. But um, you know, we used that as a moment. But second, we used it to like kind of help simplify the financing and operations and management of this crucial device. But what that did was actually end up cannibalizing potentially. We're still, not seeing the impacts, but potentially cannibalizing our business in the 2 to 3 year timeframe um, and I think as a nonprofit, that was absolutely the right move because we weren't in the business to sell
Right.
devices. Um, and so it will see what happens and if I still have a job in 3 years, but I think it's allowed us to kind of then open up a much bigger problem set that we can bring AI and data and all these other kind of cutting edge tools to help solve. Because we weren't overly focused on that. But it's an interesting question to me. Would we have done it as a for profit? I don't
Yeah,
know.
and not only that, and if you'd raise capital, like it's not necessarily your decision; it's your investor's decision as to making that right call.
That's
Um,
right.
and
That's
so
right.
we have talked ad nauseum and late nights and group calls and things around this challenge of where do you try to draw the line around your business model. So you mentioned sensors, you run an amazing IoT network, you have that data feeding in. You can obviously surface like this clinic, yesterday at 4 p.m. had a fridge error. But then somebody's got to go do something about it. Right. And the government's got to be set up to be able to be responsive to all the data you're collecting and all the analytics you can provide. Um, you and I have talked a lot about this like kind of phrase or mental model, like can you get to owning the outcome? Can you come up with a business model where you are able to contribute all the way to owning the outcome? And if you can, that lets you in some ways, like as you said, you can bring in AI, then you can do all these things. But if you're just a cog or like one part, it's really hard. And in some ways, it can be incredibly demoralizing when you're like, look, I solved my problem. You told me you were going to solve your problem. Now that you're not, it
Mhm,
makes the problem I solved not that important, or not that valuable. Um,
mhm.
and I'm curious, you more than almost anybody I know contributed towards like almost creating an ecosystem to do cold chain monitoring, and then cannibalized your business, and did what everybody says they want us to do, which is like scale, institutionalize. And then I think you got some grief for then trying to like pivot into your next business model, or maybe still are, but that was kind of fascinating. So, you worked with some of the biggest players, WHO, Gavi, to get IoT standardized, to then, didn't somebody also copy even your standalone device? Or yeah,
Yeah, which is part
that's
of
supposed to happen,
that's
right? If
great.
you
Yeah,
create a functioning
that's
market.
success.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
And
That's
so,
right.
but how are you thinking about it now? So, okay, if the cannibalization of the hardware business and it goes directly into the fridge, how does that open up opportunities for you? How does that challenge what you're focused on? Like, just
hmm
talk us through how you're thinking about that. And obviously, we're in a moment in time right now where, you know, kind of tough to predict any market or funding sources, but just curious how you're thinking about that, as you've already pre kind of global turmoil had been transitioning out of the hardware game.
Yeah. I love that question, and I think you're bringing up two um, very related questions. So I want to circle back to your first question of like owning the outcome and like what does that really mean, um, as well, because it's sort of like there's owning the outcome and then there's like financing for the outcome, which is like, an additional thing that you and I talk about quite a bit. But just coming back to Nextleaf's pivot, it has been uh, a kind of like a 3-year slow pivot. And so it definitely predated the global turmoil. I think what's really interesting is the ways in which global health does move so slowly. So actually the pivot, truth be told, is actually 5 years old, which is when we first started working to get these standards in place, with Gavi and UNICEF. Um, and we did not anticipate that even once the standard was developed and approved, it would still take another 4 to 5 years for it to actually materialize in the market, which is why the official launch of like procurements doesn't change until January 1st, 2026. So it's been this like fascinating, very slow moving kind of pivot, actually. But sadly, I still underestimated how long it would take us as a business for us to match that. So what I mean is that like, well, 5 years ago or more, we had the vision for like, okay, the next thing to solve in order to own the outcome of potent vaccines to children, the next thing to solve is exactly as you're saying, John, that it's not enough to generate the data. We've really got to help countries build out the processes and like the accountability mechanisms and the structures to act on that data. But while we had the vision for that 5, 6 years ago, um, it took even Nextleaf as a business that long to actually bring in the right talent and like change the story in the sector of Nextleaf and who we are. And also even shift our strategy. So while on the one hand, we think of ourselves as super fast moving, there's always this kind of like mismatch, almost impedance mismatch that can actually bounce back and reflect
Right.
back to us. So because the sector moved so slowly, it actually bounced back and like we started to move really slowly. So the impedance mismatch is kind of fascinating there. But yeah, so it's taken a while. And even just this morning, I was talking to my head of strategic partnerships and comms, and we were talking about how we actually have to redo all of our materials yet again. So, I think it's ironically for us right now, what I'm seeing is that it's less about product market fit in that, like, there's a lot of interest in this kind of moving from devices to really helping countries build out the processes and build out the training mechanisms and the funding mechanisms to solve maintenance and, you know, solve the whole outcome. I'm seeing Nextleaf doesn't have to own that whole outcome. And I think that's especially important in this moment as everybody's budgets shrink. I think we're seeing that there's a lot of partners who do want to come around the same table to say, okay, if the outcome is potent vaccines and we know we've got to solve training and processes and all of this, like there's actually, I think, a lot of interest in in coming together to solve it. So I'm hopeful we don't have to own it alone. But in terms of our pivot, we are, I think, now finally at the point where the external messaging matches the internal messaging, matches what countries are expecting from us. So we've got some nice alignment, but it feels like it's 3 months
Yeah.
old. So
But and like one of the analogies that the Steel Foundation for Hope, our major PRI investor, I was getting advice as we were going into management week, and he's like, don't be a car company trying to build a gas platform and an EV platform. He's like, if you if you know what the gas business is and you're serious about the EV business, you can't run both, and
Yeah.
so I'm curious,
Yeah.
as you kind of transition massively in this, like, how have you guys had those strategic discussions on the hardware business? And I'm curious, actually, 5 years ago when you were first debating, the standards-based
Mhm.
approach, were you like, oh, we can have it both ways? We'll like promote the standard and then we can still make money off our hardware. Or were you guys like, this is a real, like, if we succeed at this new path, we're like putting our current business out of business? Like, was it start discussions like that? Or was there more like optimism that you could do both?
That's a great question. First of all, that advice from Joe is like such like classic Joe advice. It's why, I still think of him as just like one of the strongest kind of thought leaders in this space. So, I think he does it. Yeah. y- Uh, anyways, yeah, just to say, yeah, love that. Um, so I'm right about almost nothing in life ever, and my kids will like 100% attest to that. So it feels weird to say this, but actually, when we had this vision 5, 6 years ago, we actually went in knowing that it would cannibalize and kill our device business. It's partly why my board didn't give a fair amount of pushback slash threaten to try to find another CEO who would, kind of not take these insane bets. But no, Martin and I knew that if we were successful, and it was a big if, I think we're all familiar with that XKCD cartoon about the like lots of standards that keep accruing. And it's like, oh, yeah, we're just going to build another one. Like standards never work. Standards are never the answer. And yet, it was the right time, right set of partners. We did actually like succeed in this standard. And yeah, it is going to cannibalize the business. We did not predict how long it would take, but no, we knew that we couldn't do both. Less for the reasons that I think Joe would bring up, that Joe's also brought up with me, which I think he's bringing it up more from like an operational perspective. Like a business has to focus. You just got to like make the bet and like put all your resources behind it. It was less for that because I am known to spread out my resources way too thin. It was much more just like we saw it as an inevitability. If we were successful, then the inevitable outcome would be that our device business would go away, even if we wanted to operate both. So we just didn't have as much choice in the matter. And honestly, right now, John, we are kind of operating both. So there's that.
All right. Well, so on to the next gen business, the software side, like how you mentioned, like not owning the whole problem, but like what are you thinking about as the
Yeah.
problem space you're trying to tackle now? And um, obviously we're in this period of declining funding, potentially massive declining funding. The U.S.
Yep.
Budget that came out as a 50% decrease on USAID spending. We've heard of horrendously bad amounts for vaccines. So obviously we have to do more with less. As you think about what you're focused on, what you're trying to do, like, is this a hidden opportunity for you in terms of like conversations that used to be stalled now are like, oh wait, now that there's less money going around, we absolutely want the thing that you were talking to us about.
Yeah. Um, so, and I'm going to ask you back the same question. So, be ready for that. Okay. So I'll give you the kind of easy answer, um, and then tell you the things that I'm still sort of really pondering about. But um, yes, it has actually been this hidden opportunity for us. So very concretely, the sector has spent billions of dollars on equipment in the last 3 years or more. 3 years or roughly, yeah. So that billions of dollars that have been spent, there was a lot of good intention, but not necessarily a lot of actual resourcing of maintenance for that equipment. And, I won't tell you who it is, but I have heard a number of prominent leaders in the space actually advocate for, we'll just have to buy more equipment all over again in a few years because that's really going to be the only way to sustain these things. And so we have been beating a drum around maintenance and no, let's invest in countries' ability to maintain that equipment that is being bought. whether it's a Nexleaf device to monitor refrigerators, or a fridge, or an incubator, or a solar panel, or a computer, whatever that piece of equipment is, we've always advocated for maintenance. And I will say in the last 4 months, countries have always been invested because, countries have always operated with that very resource limited approach. And so maintenance has always made sense at the country level. It is now suddenly making sense at the global donor level in a way that it did not. And I should add, I think global donors were always supportive. It's just that it wasn't the number one or two or three priority. And so I think now suddenly maintaining that equipment has become like the number one or two priority in a way that it just wasn't. So that's more what's like lining up. So I think that's the first opportunity. The second opportunity is something that you and I have talked about a bit, not a lot, but because of the way funding has flowed, there's been a lot of inefficiency in how actual supply chains work on the ground. And so you can have side by side a fridge for a vaccine sitting next to a fridge for HIV or, insulin or other drugs. And so suddenly I think that is just not going to be possible anymore. It's just the reality. So I think that's going to shift, and that's really matches up with our vision, which is country's vision of having a single integrated solution for all equipment rather than a vaccine solution for equipment and a separate, so that's another opportunity that we're getting a lot more traction on. And then finally, what we're seeing is that um, the types of things that are funded, I think, is going to change dramatically. So what I mean is things like capacity building and trainings, which right now, if you look at like Global Fund's budget, it's something like 20 to 25% of Global Fund's program budget goes towards training and capacity building. And actually 60% of that goes towards travel. And so what we're looking at is building out solutions that are much more AI-enabled, digital, online, which has been done, but we're focused on an operational use case. So rather than the clinical side of things, we've said, hey, the operational use cases here are like quick wins. We can solve those with these digital training solutions. And just yesterday morning, one country, I won't name the country, but called us and said, we just implemented a travel freeze across the country. So it turns out we can no longer do in-person trainings and capacity buildings. And we said, okay, great news. We've actually anyways been shifting towards this AI-enabled, on-demand, on-site, kind of training approach. So this is this great opportunity we thought we'd test it out later this year, but you know what? Let's test it out tomorrow. So I think there's a number of opportunities globally and at the country level. So I'm curious for you, what do you kind of seeing in terms of course, like the resource limitations is hurting all of us. So, I didn't say the obvious, but
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
just
exactly
brutal.
as you said. I think, the resource limitations that I unfortunately guess health system strengthening budgets are going to face, they were a huge part of what USAID was funding. They're part of what Gavi funds, what Global Fund funds. So that, putting that aside, but I think that the total envelope shrinking at some level is such a decimating event that the
Yep.
opportunities, sometimes feel like they are not really opportunities in that context. But yeah, there's definitely discussions we're now having. One, when this first started to happen in January, I talked to Amy about this and others. I was like, we're about to find out if people actually liked CommCare because, this was always third-party funded. We have some government contracts, but I'm like, either they're going to pick up the phone and start calling us right away, or they're going to let it die.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
all of our customers, all of our government partners picked up the phone, fortunately. So we were like
Uh-huh.
really heartened to see the interest in maintaining and in some cases even growing the footprint they had with CommCare. And Amy and I spent a ton of time coming up with our impact delivery framework, which is really trying to say exactly what you said, Nithya, of we can't have two fridges next to each other that do basically the same function for two different supply chains. Similarly, we can't have digital tools that have the capability to do 5 use cases and then pick 5 different tools for 5 use cases. That was true even before because there wasn't enough talent, there wasn't enough capability. Now there's also just nowhere near enough budget. So we think there's substantial opportunity. And frankly, I think in the old industry and expectations, like kind of the only discussion you could really have with the government was, I'll give you 100% of what you want for 100% of the cost. And I hope that what happens now is we can say, I can give you 80% of what you want for 20% of the cost. And I think before, that argument would never work because somebody, they weren't paying the bill. So what do they care about the difference between 20%
Yeah.
and 100%? They'd rather take the thing
Yeah.
that gave them 100%. Um,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's really where we're pushing right now, which requires us to simplify offerings. It requires us to make things way easier to deploy. It requires, what you said, standardized training, standardized SOPs. And I think there's a
Yep.
huge potential to maintain, the tens of millions of dollars that have been invested in these digital community health systems that we support, to maintain them. And I think they're going to be critical because
Mhm.
that's how vaccines are getting out. That's how behavior change communication is going to get out. That's how family planning is going to get out. Like the community health workforce is even more important in today's
Mhm.
ecosystem than it was before all these changes.
Mhm.
The other thing, that we've been working on and have talked about on this podcast and I've talked about with you before is our new platform to enable, payment for verified service delivery. And I think that's also going to offer maybe more organizations who previously, maybe yesterday were like, I don't really care about the difference between, 50% cost effectiveness. I'd rather just do what's easy. Now I think nobody can accept saying that. I don't think anybody will say that. Every dollar matters now. Every dollar that's got to go further. And my hope is that as we stand up this platform, as we prove more use cases on it, it offers a way for governments to engage, for the funding landscape to engage, and for a really robust, resilient, and dynamic workforce to do great work in the field and to get paid for doing so. So we're seeing that as the
So
yeah,
let
go
me
ahead.
I want to ask you something about that because I think the verified service delivery model that Demagi's doing is just, I think it's the future. I think it's brilliant. I'm kind of wondering, what are you saying as like what needs to be true, like actually true? Do you know what I mean? In order for that to work in a way that like hasn't been true, because I think verified service delivery, we've built it in other sectors like clean cooking, like we've seen it work. And so, but it hasn't really taken off. Like I looked at the Global Fund's budget last night and like their pay for performance line item was like, I forget, but I think it was like, 0.5% or something, right? So, so people are talking about pay for performance, but it's like not actually scaling the way that
Yep.
it should. So what do you think needs to be true or is true now that wasn't
Yeah,
a
it's
year
a, it's a
ago
great it's a
for
great
that to?
question, Amy. Curious to get your take, just having heard me talk about this for so long too. I think one of the challenges is like there are very few mechanisms that could reasonably take on a pay for performance contract. Right. So let's take Nextleaf's business model. If you try to take on a pay
Mm-hmm.
for performance, not of fridges correctly monitored, but of, vaccines, quote
Potent
vaccines,
vaccines. Yep.
you now have a dependency on the
Yep.
local workforce. You now have a dependency on,
That's right.
so you like can't take
Yep.
on that contract. And so, or I mean, you could, but like yeah,
But like, it's a
exactly.
lot of risk.
And so, um, one of the things that we kind of cracked with Connect that we hope is durable is it turns out very obviously local organizations who've been operating in these communities for decades are phenomenally resourceful, can figure out who the good
Mm-hmm.
workforces are, know the hard to reach areas, can connect all the dots, have the relationships with the governments. And if you can get them the funding
Mm-hmm.
they always should have been getting in the first place, they can
Mm-hmm.
solve so many of these problems that make, being a US based huge organization
Mm-hmm.
unwilling or unable to take on a performance based contract. So part of what I think we cracked and part
Mm-hmm.
of what I think is necessary is, I think the mental model a lot of people had is you have these social enterprises that do amazing work, but they don't scale. You have these big
Mm-hmm.
INGOs that can scale, but are crazy expensive and high overhead. And then everybody was talking about localization, but nobody was really figuring out how to get more money flowing.
That's right.
I'm hoping the
Yeah.
unlock is combining the performance-based, the targeted, the verified service delivery that everybody kind of wanted, but never knew how to contract with these local partners. And when you add in digital, so it's now easy for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hoping that's the
Mm-hmm.
unlock, because for a lot of these
Mm-hmm.
organizations, you need audited financials just to contract with, the former US government. You
Totally.
needed, really sophisticated ways to interact. And digital tools, particularly, AI enabled digital tools, can have a huge amplification effect that was just too hard before. Even
Mm-hmm.
in our core platforms, if you had offered me a contract to say like, I'll pay you $1 per high performing CHW in this country, do you want that contract or do you want $1 million for 3 years to stand up your system? From a Demagi business model standpoint, there's so many things in the way of me that I don't control, that I
Mm-hmm.
don't have influence over on the CHW side, that it's really hard to take on that performance-based contract. So a really long-winded answer, but the hope is that with digitization, with localization, we can open up this pathway to scale, which is not a huge NGO, not an unscalable small organization, but lots
Mm-hmm.
of independent organizations who can gain a new capability and go deliver it successfully and
Mm-hmm.
have the digital footprint to prove they did deliver it.
Yeah, I think it's super compelling. It's really the direction that we're actually, ultimately going as well. And I think the question is just going to be, to your point, like how big do you scope out performance? I think scoping out performance as a well-monitored fridge, that's way too small. Yeah, that's bullshit. Um, but scoping it as a vaccine, a child that is protected for life against measles, well, that's too big. So what is that kind of right? And you've called it this, John, the right unit of impact, which I think is the question here. And it's something that we're thinking about quite a bit as we sort of look at this model that our current board, by the way, who agrees with me a lot more, has been really pushing us to think about, which is like, how do we think about ourselves as more of that enabling platform for the local organizations that are going to be closer to the problem, or the local, kind of outsourced service providers, who are often the ones contracted by the government anyways. Like, how do we become the digital enabler of them? But where they're using data not just to get a report card, or not just to find out that a fridge isn't working, that they always knew, but they're really getting to use this platform as a way to mobilize more resources to solutions that are working, to challenges and problems that really need solving. So, I really think this is the future, and I'm really excited about it. And I think, especially with IoT data and sensor data, as you and I've talked about, it's like uniquely then able to verify that certain outcomes are like truly happening. But yeah, again, scoping that unit of impact, I think, becomes really important. I mean, I think one of the things that I'm thinking about that I'm curious how you're approaching is like what we've learned over the years is that like getting what countries want to line up with like where donors are at and like ready to pay for, and getting those two things to line up with where the procurement and contracting mechanisms are. Those are actually, it turns out, three completely different beasts. And the contracting and procurement mechanisms, as you well know, is its own bureaucracy that like it's unclear anybody has control over, which is why it sort of stayed in this like murky area. And so, one way to deal with that is like to completely unresource that, bureaucracy, which is maybe what's happening. I don't know. But getting these three things to really line up away from pay for activity to pay for outcome, is really, really hard. And, we worked with the World Bank to develop out a pay for outcome in a totally different sector in clean cooking, and like, worked with like really brilliant, committed, passionate people at the World Bank, built out this great framework, demonstrated stuff. But then it turned out it wasn't even the bureaucracy or countries that slowed things down. It was, this whole other thing that blew it all up. So just to say, I guess, yes, I think we can both strongly agree this is the future, and you have a solution out of the box that, is going to solve it. And yet, I guess I'm kind of like, I'm wondering, as we head in that direction, I'm also wondering, like, what are some of the other things that could potentially blow this up?
Totally. And I think the ways in which funding will flow now and how that might change in the future is a huge area that is
Agreed.
under innovated in. And you can see this in all governments, all markets, all regulatory environments. If more headspace, talent, time was going to fixing that problem, I think a lot of other things would get fixed. Like you mentioned those three big problems. I think procurement is like vastly under invested in compared to the other two, right? And
Agreed.
um,
Innovating
yeah,
in procurement.
yes, exactly. And so I can have the perfect pay for outcomes platform or solution, and I barely can get like a SaaS deal done on the software side with a lot of these partners.
Yeah.
I don't have,
Yeah.
short-term expectations that I'm going to get them onto a pay for outcomes contract. And so a lot of the learning I'm trying to do now is talk to governments, talk to the World Bank, talk to folks who have like seen procurement innovation happen, know this is going to take a while, and then find out like what role can we / should we be playing or need to play in order to have this pathway to pay for outcome. But I think it's really hard. Like even in the domestic market, which Demagi also serves here in the United States, people talk about paid for outcomes, not activities. And like we spend trillions of, like, this is a really important problem lots of people care about, and we can't crack it. So it's also just like hard to find that unit of impact, that unit of outcome that you can reliably contract for. And so I think we're going to need a lot of innovation, a lot of iteration. And unfortunately, these are the government to private sector contract is like not one people have a lot of appetite to fail and iterate on. So there's also a huge risk of a couple bad deals or a couple approaches not working that could really turn people off to even trying. So there's that danger too of we talked about this with digital health back in the day of like, doing a CHW project that doesn't have a path to scale might really turn, lots of pilots a decade ago had no path to scale, but like, I think governments got turned off during that process and then didn't push as hard as they could have, which maybe led to worse outcomes, for some of their citizens.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I think is I think I disagree a little bit, and maybe I'm, misunderstanding what you're saying, but I don't think it's like a lack of appetite to innovate per se. Like in some ways, like if we throw more innovation, put it another way, if we just threw our best minds at it, like let's say, John, like quit your day job and you're like, I'm just like, you're the smartest person in the room in every room you go to. So like, let's say you decide to crack procurement. I still don't think that's going to be enough. Like, I don't think it's better innovation. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think the problem has to be so painful and like it has to shift. And the example that I think about a lot is medical records. I mean, if you ask you're married to a doctor, I'm married to a doctor, right? Like, if you ask any doctor, one of their like least favorite parts of their job is dealing with medical records. Like they just hate it, and yet why does every doctor deal with medical records? Because that's how they get paid. They can't get paid if they don't deal with the medical record. So like, EMR technology, I don't know anything about the tech, but like, I understand that it's like not great, whatever. But it's kind of just the only way to get paid. And so in some ways I feel like, I don't know what the direct, corollary is here, but like, something's got to shift so that the only way for, I don't know, a country or an organization, you and me, a technician, whoever it is, like the only way for money to flow is once it goes into the record and you can verify the service delivery or whatever. Like, I think that's going to be the shift. It's not that we need the best pay for performance like contract or the best technology even. But I don't know how we get there. Like, but that's the EMR example really stays with me.
Yeah, and that's a great example. And I think we do operate in that space a bit. And I think a lot of people are like, wait, what did we just spend $50 billion building and deploying? Like, where is this improving health outcomes? And so I think we do need that digital record, but at the same time, not as an end to itself in service of verifying the outcome, right? Because I think a lot of EMRs and a lot of digital technology turns into like a documentation task, whether that's like an internal employee tool, and Amy has a lot of experience like thinking through our marketing tools and our sales tools. And it's like lots of companies deploy Salesforce in a way that's like super annoying to deal with. And you're like back entering data and it's all about just proving that you're doing your job, not helping you do your job. And in a lot of ways, that's what EMRs have turned into for a lot of physicians and providers in the United States and elsewhere. And so how do we avoid that trap while still having that digital record? Because absolutely what you're saying, if we can get that record and that's how the transaction gets kind of completed, all sorts of innovation can happen on top of that, right? But you got to get into some transactional model that you can then measure improvement upon. And if we can't get that foundation there, it makes it really, really difficult to plug in and solve your part of the problem.
I know. Part of me wonders, like, maybe we're going about this all wrong. Like, maybe by focusing on impact and trying to actually get better health outcomes, we're somehow missing the mark. And actually, if we just focused on the transactional, maybe, I don't know. I hope that's not true, because like I've dedicated my whole life to that not being true. But I sometimes wonder about that. I mean, this kind of gets to something that, I think about, like, the data value chain, which is like, every time data exchanges hands, like, it's got to give value to each person who's touching that data. Otherwise, yeah, like, somebody at some point, like, some nurse is going to stop filling out a logbook, or, some district supervisor is going to stop looking at that logbook if it's not generating enough value. So it's something that I was thinking about as you were describing that. I mean, I think that's the dream for all of us.
Absolutely. And the way in which those outcomes can manifest, or like that kind of going for that ultimate impact goal, I think as you're looking at how your business is pivoting, as we're trying to extend what we do and to connect and offering impact directly in the market and these other things, it's also a question of, like, if you're not running a gas and an EV company at the same time, then whatever that big bold bet is that we're all switching to, what does the ideal customer profile look like? What does the ideal transaction look like?
Mm,
And does it
yeah.
exist at all in a small way that you can then grow and kind of fan the flame of, or does it not exist at all?
It's a great
Right?
question.
Because
Yeah.
all of us in the previous state of USAID, we were going after everything. We were, sometimes doing a services contract, sometimes doing a product contract, just trying to, for the right reasons, make as much impact as one could. And now I think a lot of us are going to have to make really tough calls on what businesses are we really in, what do we really want our business model to be, and is that market really big enough? Like, are there enough people who want to do business in the way that we think we're best able to do business to achieve the outcome we think we're best suited to do? And I think to a large extent, everybody was ignoring do you want to do business the way I want to do business? Because my solution can work, and you can agree you want that outcome, and you can just not want to do business the way I want to do business. Like, that's a normal thing that happens all the time. And so, are there enough people who want to do business the way you want to do business to create that impact with them? Is going to become a very prominent question. And I think a lot of us were just like, well, nobody wants to do business the way USAID does, so we can't. Right? We can all just accept we have to go. We can accept we have to deal with the beast, but that's not
Yeah.
the situation we're all in now. Now we have to define, like, what is the way we
Yeah.
want to do business, and do we have enough business partners that want to do it that way?
I agree with that. And I mean, I think as we, like, close this conversation, I guess one of the things I might frame it a little differently, which is, like, we all have this opportunity to think about collectively how we do want to do business in absence of USAID, which was this kind of great tractor beam for positive or otherwise. I think now without that, the system has been burned down. And, I think for even the first 4 months of this year, or 3 months of this year, we've all talked about, like, well, when or if the system gets burned down. And I think it's fair to say the system has been burned down. And so this is kind of our moment to really figure out together how we do want to do business together, and sort of what do some of those, like, as you said, ideal transactions and ideal customers and ideal use cases and ideal frames for outcomes really look like. But kind of feel like we have this moment, we're living history in development.
I love that. That's a great place to end.
Wow. This has been,
Cool.
I usually jump in all the time, but this has just been, like, such a beautiful unfolding, and so much rich insight, and really, yeah, a lot of food for thought here. So many more questions coming up for me, but I feel like I'm so impressed that you didn't go dark. I thought we were going to go really dark, but you're leaving me with hope.
Oh, good.
And
Good.
I think, yeah, I'd love to continue this conversation, Nithya, on a future
Yeah.
episode potentially, because this is really unfolding. And to your point, we're living history right now. Wow, so much to think about there. A massive thank you to Nithya Ramanathan from Nexleaf Analytics for really opening up and sharing her journey and some incredibly valuable insights with us today. So as we wrap this one up, I wanted to share a few of my key takeaways. First, don't be afraid to shake up your business model. Nithya's story about Nexleaf switching from for-profit to nonprofit really drives home that sometimes you've got to change your setup to actually make the impact you're aiming for and get the right people listening. Second, sometimes you have to cannibalize your own business for the greater good. Nexleaf made a decision to help standardize Internet of Things and vaccine fridges, even though it cut into their own sales. That's a huge lesson in playing the long game and thinking about the whole sector, not just your slice of it. Third, pivoting takes time and getting everyone on the same page. As Nithya laid out, big shifts, especially in global health, don't happen overnight. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Needing the right team and making sure what you're saying outside matches what you're building inside. Fourth, it's about the outcome, not just the tool. We talked a lot about this, moving past just handing over data or a device and really stepping up to help make sure the desired result happens. That might mean teaming up in new ways as the funding world changes. Fifth, the system's burned down, now what? This was a big one. It sounds a bit stark, but it's also a massive opportunity. With all the current shakeups, it's our chance to rethink how we all work together and really focus on what delivers real, verifiable impact. Definitely a lot to chew on there, and we really hope it sparks some ideas for your own work. That's our show. Please like, rate, review, subscribe, and share this episode if you found it useful. It really helps us grow our impact. And write to us at podcast@demagi.com with any ideas, comments, or feedback. This show is executive produced by myself. Parthana Balachandar and Michael Kelleher are our producers, and cover art is by Sudhanshu Kant. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next episode.